The actualising tendency is basically the general inclination for any organism to grow as best it can. This is whether it's a plant, an animal, or a human. So for example, if a plant's growing somewhere where it can't get much water, it'll still grow, but it'll probably grow in a different way to how it would grow if it did have water. And that's the general principle across all life forms. Things want to grow. Life is an active thing rather than just a passive thing. Everything has something in it that makes it want to move towards growth. Carl Rogers' example that he talks about in A Way of Being is of a memory he has from his childhood where they'd store a load of potatoes for the winter in a basement, and the potatoes would tend to sprout and grow as best they could towards what little light there was down there. This following quote is of his reflections on that and the impression it had on him. "The conditions were unfavourable, but the potatoes began to sprout. Pale, white sprouts, so unlike the healthy green shoots they sent up when planted in the soil in the spring. But these sad, spindly sprouts would grow 2 or 3 feet in length as they reached towards the distant light of the window. The sprouts were, in their bizarre, futile growth, a sort of desperate expression of the directional tendency. They'd never become plants, never mature, never fulfil their real potential. But under the most adverse circumstances, they were striving to become. Life would not give up, even if it could not flourish." Whether an organism is given everything it needs in order to thrive, or it's given the bare minimum it needs in order to barely survive, that organism will do its best in whatever situation it finds itself in. They're going to grow in different ways. They're going to grow the best they can, but they're going to grow in different ways. With this in mind, it doesn't seem sensible to look at a plant that's been deprived of its needs and decide that that plant is representative of the true nature of plants. And the same logic within humanistic psychology applies to humans. We shouldn't look at the worst things that people do and decide that that's representative of true human nature. That's the truth of who we are and what we're really like. You could say it's when a person's gone through certain things and they've had to adapt desperately to their environment, like the potato plant. They've had to adapt elements of themselves in order to survive. People can adapt in all kinds of different ways. Maybe not feeling things is one of them. Maybe not empathizing with people anymore because that'll bring up too many feelings that are just too painful. You know, there can be a real survival instinct in people, which is the actualising tendency in practice in its own way. That doesn't necessarily tell you very much about what that person might have been capable of and what they may have been like if they had gone through a whole different set of circumstances where they had had all of their needs met. Just to give an example of this in practice, this is James Gilligan's book called Violence, Reflections on a National Epidemic. He's an American writer. He's writing about the time that he spent, decades actually, that he spent as a psychiatrist in the prison system. And he writes about the experiences he's had with the people in prison who have done extremely violent, extremely terrible things. And he says at one point in this book how, almost without exception, these people have been through some very deep trauma themselves. The reason I mention this is because these terrible acts and these terrible things that happen, people who do these things are often explained away as being evil, which in my opinion doesn't do justice to the situation at all. I don't think it explains anything. Actually, if something like murder or anything else is understandable, and if there is some kind of pattern here between going through some serious trauma and being capable of these kinds of acts, then I think that kind of thing is something that we need to be aware of. Understanding it on a psychological level and understanding what kind of risk factors are involved in people doing these things, that's the way we're going to bring about a reduction in these kinds of horrible things happening. The quote here then is, "I have yet to see a serious act of violence that was not provoked by the experience of feeling shamed and humiliated, disrespected and ridiculed, and that did not represent the attempt to prevent or undo this loss of face, no matter how severe the punishment, even if it includes death." If there's some truth in this then, and I don't think this perspective is particularly out there and left field amongst people who research this kind of thing, if there is truth in it, it begs the question of what we can do to reduce this kind of thing. And James Gilligan's suggestion is essentially to look after each other, especially when people are children, so that they don't suffer abuse and deprivation, and they don't develop the kind of shame that often results from that in the first place. So to look at it in terms of the actualising tendency, we want to try and create an environment where people can grow with their needs met, so they don't have to adapt to the circumstances. I make a point of talking about violence mainly because the person-centred approach is often associated with a really positive view of human nature, and so I kind of want to make a point of not shying away from these things. Obviously, people can go through all kinds of things and never become violent. Certainly never become violent towards other people. Many people might become violent towards themselves. And many other people may go through some things and have to adapt and not be violent in any way. I'm just using this as an extreme example. Whether it's turning down your feelings so you can't feel anything and you feel numb. Maybe it's being on high alert all the time for any possible danger, or any number of other things that could come about. What we often regard as mental health symptoms are actually, I think, better seen as adaptations to circumstances that you've been through and the organism trying to protect you. Of course, if you want wonderful, beautiful, flourishing plants, then give them everything they need in order to survive in the first place. Don't play catch up after depriving them for however long. And that's basically what James Gilligan says in relation to people. Rather than trying to support people after they've gone through loads of traumatic stuff, maybe let's try and figure out a way so people don't go through that stuff in the first place. Maybe that'll be easier. Just to go into this a bit more, here is Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's a really famous and renowned book on the subject of trauma. He talks about the ACE studies towards the end of his book. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experience, and it was a very in-depth study looking at the impact of ACEs on a person's development. If you Google ACE or Adverse Childhood Experience, you'll find out more about it. There's lots of stuff online if you're interested in learning more about it. There's a range of different experiences that can count as ACEs, including sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and quite a few others. There are lists online of the criteria that they used, that they counted as adverse childhood experiences. They did this study though, and as the results came in, apparently the lead researcher was in tears as he was talking about the results that they'd found. When the ACE study data started to appear on his computer screen, he realised that they'd stumbled upon the gravest and most costly public health issue in the United States: child abuse. He'd calculated that its overall costs exceeded those of cancer or heart disease, and that eradicating child abuse in America would reduce the overall rate of depression by more than half, alcoholism by 2/3, and suicide, IV drug use and domestic violence by 3/4. It would also have a dramatic effect on workplace performance and vastly decrease the need for incarceration. So in summary, people go through stuff, they need to adapt, and those adaptations don't let go because it's helped them survive. These things aren't necessarily a life sentence though, as he goes into here. Once you recognise that post-traumatic reactions started off as efforts to save your life, you may gather the courage to face your inner music, or cacophony, but you will need help to do so. I'd say may need help. I mean, people can maybe figure out things without therapy. You have to find someone you can trust enough to accompany you, someone who can safely hold your feelings and help you listen to the painful messages from your emotional brain. You need a guide who is not afraid of your terror and who can contain your darkest rage, someone who can safeguard the wholeness of you while you explore the fragmented experiences that you had to keep secret from yourself for so long. And that, in essence, is the role of therapy. I wouldn't call myself a guide though, rather maybe a co-pilot. We're both exploring together. I can only really go where the pilot, the client, decides to go, but maybe I can point things out if I notice something. I might observe something that they're not aware of, but we're exploring together. That's how I see it. We're also exploring that person's inner world, so I guess they get to decide if the observations I make are helpful or valid or not. They get to either take it on and think, oh, that's helpful, or they can just cast it aside and ignore it. What I want to do though is offer a space where they can do that exploring. And back to that plant in Roger's basement, if you start giving it what it needs, I don't know how it'll end up exactly, if it'll look exactly like it would do if it had been given everything from the beginning, but it will go in that direction. It will benefit from its needs being given to it. Maybe it will always show some signs of what it's been through, but it doesn't necessarily need to be defined by it. Life, the actualising tendency, is always an ongoing process. And we'll get into the details in the next few videos, but person-centred therapy is essentially an effort to offer a space where that kind of growth can happen.